point when it is over. At 7 minutes, the timekeeper will again signal once. After this, no more point of information may be offered for the rest of the speech. At 8 minutes, the timekeeper will make a double signal like this. After this, the speaker must conclude within a few seconds. There will be a short break at the end of each speech for the judges to complete their notes. After the 6 main speeches, each team will have the opportunity to make 4-minute reply speech. This can be made by either the first or second speaker on each team. No point of information are allowed during the reply speeches. The opposition will make their reply speech first. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. Before the debate begins, I would like to remind you to switch off all mobile phones and anything else which might disturb the debaters. Should you need to leave or enter the room or for any reason during the debate, please wait until the end of the speech to do so. Audience members should be aware that they may not participate in the main debate. There will be an opportunity to make comments after the judges have left the room at the end of the debate. I would like to introduce the judges for this debate. They are Victoria Lapadula from Argentina, who is the chair. Simona Mazilu from Romania. And from Singapore. In opposition for this debate, we have the team from Japan. Their first speaker is Ayumi Sudo. Their second speaker is Masahito Nakamichi. Their third speaker is Mai Kambara. Their speech will be delivered by Ayumi Sudo. And in opposition, we have the team from United States of America. Their first speaker is Sarah Lanier. Their second speaker is Paulette Faulkner. And their third speaker is Ali Grossman. Their speech will be delivered by Paulette Faulkner. The motion for this debate is this House believes that states should not erect statues or memorial which commemorate or glorify military campaigns or the service of soldiers in war. It gives me great pleasure to invite the first speaker for the proposition team to open the debate. Please welcome Ayumi Sudo.
When the Chinese Communist Party creates war memorials that glorify their conduct in the war, that skews the narrative and oppresses people from speaking out and having the discourse that they need to about the war. Because we think that the state cannot impose narratives that glorify war, we are proud to propose this motion. So, first I'd like to talk about our model, and then I'm going to bring 2 points in my speech. One, how the erecting of statues or memorials that glorify war skews narrative and oppresses discourse. Two, why it is illegitimate for the state to skew this narrative of war. But before that, our model. 2 main points. One, what do we mean when we say that statues or memorials commemorate or glorify war? We think that these are cases when you don't show the objective facts, like fighting took place here, but the memorials that say that the Okinawa War took place here and thousands of people died and they were languished and killed by American troops. That's the kind of subjective narrative, no thank you, that these statues have, and that these things we move back. And secondly, we're happy to create third parties of those who were involved in that past war, as well as historians to allow memorials with balanced perspectives or education that allows balanced perspectives. And we will allow individuals to create these memorials on their own properties or in their own ways, but we don't think that the state should do this uniquely. So, moving on to my first point, no thank you, about how this erection of these statues skews narrative and oppresses discourse. So what impacts does it have on the people when the state erects these memorials that glorify war? We think that it skews the narrative of war. Why? Because when you see these state-owned structures and statues and memorials, you only see that one narrative at a time. There's no instance when you have a Chinese narrative of the war as well as the Russian narrative of the war at the same time, because they both glorify war, right? These are conflicting opinions. Thus, we think that when you only see this one narrative, you're influenced in a way that causes you to have this skewed narrative. Especially since it's state-funded, it is put in popular and important destinations. Like in Trafalgar Square, you have the memorial of the Sir Trafalgar who fought against Bonaparte. And it becomes visibly a source, since it's always so visible, it becomes a source of identity for the people. And moreover, because it is considered a state-created narrative of war, it's considered as a legitimate interpretation of that war. When the state creates a national war memorial museum, then people think that that's the right narrative and the only narrative that there is on war. It is extremely hard for other narratives on that war to fight against that, that interpretation of war that glorifies war. So people can't say that the war was unjust or should never have happened, or it's because it's seen as unpatriotic or as a traitor to that nation. When you have memorials that glorify the Afghan war, it is hard for people to say that Afghan war, that soldiers should not have gone to the Afghan war in the first place, because you show these people that people have literally died in that war. You oppress discourse when the state creates these structures. Yes.
Would you close down the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam because it talks about war?
If it skews the narrative of war, we're happy to close these down. What we want is a third party or a balanced opinion of war to be the one that tells and teaches people. No, thank you. We think that in this situation, other voices cannot just compete with the state narrative. When what we prefer is a world where we allow the people to decide for themselves about the war, because there is no inherent good or bad when it comes to war, or no inherent victim versus oppressor. We think that people should have this discussion themselves, and the state should not be the one to sanction this one-sided, skewed narrative. Second point, why is it illegitimate for the state to skew the narrative of past war? We think that because the state has the responsibility to allow each individual to grow as individuals themselves, as a future participant in a democratic society, you cannot brainwash these people into one way of thinking. You cannot skew narrative for the sake of utility of that nation, to create more nationalism and to create more unity. We think that that's completely wrong, because it changes the identity of that person when you say that your grandfather died in that war because of that other country's soldier. We think that you force these people into having these victimization feelings, or this feeling of honor towards the war and a skewed narrative. Yes?
Are you against memorials that don't have a skewed narrative?
Yes. We think that when we teach objective facts and when we show people about the different narratives of war at the same time, we get a balanced view. That's what we support, not a one-sided narrative. Okay, moving on. So, carrying on with my point, we think that when you have things like gender equality or these racial discrimination, that's the kind of thing that we're okay to impose on people, because these have something to do with universally good values of human rights, where people are not allowed to be discriminated. But when it comes to war, there is no inherent good or bad in that incident. We think that when there's no universal consensus on something that should be taught, we think that history needs to have balanced views from various opinions. We think especially important because knowledge and interpretations of history changes the way you interact with others in the long-term future. Especially when it comes to war, there's a lot of emotional and personal feelings that can be stimulated when you have these statues and when you have these war memorials. People are coerced into thinking that their country was the right country, or that their country was the oppressed country, and it was right for that nation to do that. That kind of narrative is something that's extremely harmful because you disallow people from moving forward, from cooperating with other nations, or even having a rational discussion about what should have happened and how we can prevent these atrocities from taking place in the future. We think that history has a tremendously large impact on the identity of self, and that's why it cannot be skewed for national utility. We think that because the state it is morally abhorrent for the state to create these statues and enforce a narrative that glorifies war. We are very proud to propose this motion.
Okay.
The previous speakers had 8 minutes and 1 second, 8 minutes and 1 second.
And now, to open the case for the opposition, I welcome Sarah Lanier.
Okay.
Side proposition really wanted to make today's debate about whether or not it's good to have a skewed narrative of war. Unfortunately, they completely disregard over half the motion. They don't look to whether or not states should be allowed to commemorate a military campaign. They don't even once in their speech mention whether or not we should be able to build statues that represent the service of soldiers in war. We see a lot of problems with side proposition's case, which we'll point out in rebuttal. But first, the burden for side proposition in today's debate is both twofold and extremely high. First, they have the burden to prove that on a principle level, they need to give you principle justifications for why the millions of people who fought for the government and lost their lives deserve to be forgotten by the same entity. But second, they need to give you practical reasons for why remembering the details of the human side of war creates such great harms that we shouldn't do it at all. They also need to be looking to the status quo in today's debate, which unfortunately for them isn't just a skewed side of situations, but instead is often just a presentation of information. But additionally, one clarification we want to make in today's debate is that a military campaign involves the entire operation with a clear objective for a result. Therefore, we need to be looking to the results of these campaigns, such as casualties and their aftermath. So with that, let's go into some points of rebuttal on side proposition's case before presenting our first two substantive arguments. Let's start off with their model, because we see a few problems with it. First, they state that people can do this individually. It just shouldn't be the state because it would be illegitimate. We see a lot of problems with this. First, it is much more likely that an individual who wants to create a memorial themselves will have some inherent bias to this issue than the state itself. Second, there's actually an accountability check when it comes to a memorial created by the state, especially because if citizens think it is completely illegitimate, they can use their voice and establish discourse to actually change it. There's no possible check for every single person that wants to create a statue, so their model really doesn't solve. But then their first substantive argument is on skewing the narrative and decreasing discourse. We have three responses to this. The first is we asked a POI about whether or not they were against state memorials that were not skewed. They stated that yes, they were, but then they continue to state that they only stand for memorials presenting facts and presenting the real truth behind an issue. Well, we think this is a massive contradiction on side proposition that we would like them to re-clarify, because we think it's actually good to, have education on issues and to present people with facts. But second, we would say that in the status quo, in the heart of today's debate, we are looking at legitimate memorials and services. We are looking at individual entities that provide facts on issues. For example, the Vietnam Memorial literally lists off names of people that were killed within one area within the US. This is just showing that we are trying to actually provide people this information. But the third reason our first argument stands is because people can actually be rational in the slim case that side proposition is right and that the government would create this type of biased individual service. We think that people can be rational, people can research, and they can find both sides of an issue. So their first argument really doesn't stand, and unfortunately their second doesn't either, because it is a principle that is hung on them winning the first argument, because they are very similar. Additionally, they never once in their entire speech gave you one example of where these situations have been skewed and where this type of state-sponsored memorial has skewed real information, so don't look to their individual arguments. But with that, we would like to present side opposition's first substantive argument, which is the government's principal obligation to remember. Our first layer under this is that the government has an obligation to remember the sacrifice it created. We think that citizens of a country often themselves don't decide when or not their country goes to war. Oftentimes, the war is fought over things that don't even concern the interests of the people. The government is the one creating this war, and unfortunately, soldiers often aren't even going voluntarily. They often have to go and fight against their beliefs, they often go and lose their lives, and then often they have a decreased quality of life when they come back for reasons such as PTSD and low veteran benefits. Unfortunately, we think this provides negative benefits, especially to marginalized groups. The reason is because we think that often soldiers that are going to fight in war are oppressed groups within a country. For example, the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. This was a fleet of African American men that literally sacrificed their lives for a country that wouldn't even give them rights. We think these people deserve to be recognized. We think that the government has the capability and has done so to actually portray this instance in a true way. That's why we see a memorial in the individual state, Alabama, that they originally went to go fight this war from. It is a legitimate one that commemorates individually their past. But additionally, look to the example of women in combat. It is often extremely unsafe for women to go fight in wars, but they do so anyways. It is extremely unsafe for reasons such as sexual violence that affect women more than men. However, we still create memorials to honor this. There's a memorial in Germany that specifically honors women going to fight in war. We think that these people deserve to be honored and that the government has a principal obligation to remember those that they sent to fight. But our second layer under this argument is the principal obligation to honor those that are impacted. We want to look at what a war really looks like and what a commemoration of war really looks like. We think that a war affects people like the people going to fight, but it also affects civilians and it affects all of their family members. We think that to the point where a war is extremely impactful and the defining event for an age of the people, the government has an obligation to its people and to the ones fighting to accurately represent this war. But additionally, we want to look to the fact that in the status quo, this is what we on side opposition advocate for. We advocate for this level of representation. So with that, our second substantive argument is on remembering war and how it prevents unnecessary conflicts and creates empathy. But before I move on, I'll take your point.
Okay. So when the state, is it okay for the state to write these people's name on the plaque and say that's justified for the state to have sent them to the war?
We think that there are multiple different areas in which you can honor someone. For example, there's a memorial within my home city, Houston, that has the names of every single person that was represented in the Holocaust, the names of them, and then later on goes to attribute the individual atrocities they went through. So we think that it is justified for the government to represent them in this way and that they can do so in war. But back to our second substantive argument on remembering war and preventing its unnecessary conflicts. Our first layer under this argument is not repeating mistakes. When we forget about the past, it's easier to let it happen again. But here are 5 unique reasons why side opposition provides education on these issues that proposition can't grant. First, these memorials and statues give an emotional response. But second, they can humanize the impact of war, meaning we're not treating people like statistics, but actually recognizing what they did. Third, it's much more tangible. Fourth, it's individualized. You get to actually see the stories of people. Fifth, there is a structural difference between reading something in a book and seeing it in person. It makes it more salient and it makes it easier for people to relate to these stories. We also think that we need to look to what these statues look like. We don't think side proposition paints them in the way they actually are. We think they're often serious, they are solemn, they portray the reality of war, and they force people to consider the horrors of war. But our second layer under this argument is on empathy. We think that oftentimes the people that go to museums and memorials have an increased empathy for these individual situations. This is inherently good for a few reasons. First, because it makes people actually care about the soldiers that sacrificed their lives. Second, it makes people more likely to take action against preventing this to happen again. So ultimately in today's debate on both a principle and a practical level. Side opposition isn't only giving you an actual portrayal of what the status quo looks like, but is actually trying to ensure that these people are represented in a fair way in the future. So for these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
The previous speaker spent 7 minutes and 53 seconds. 7 minutes and 53 seconds.
And now, to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Masarito Nakamichi.
We agree that a discourse about the war should be made by the citizens because it is important to remember the atrocities of war, to remember the bad parts of war, and to remember so it will not be repeated again in future history. That's why we're going to be standing exactly for that reason on Team Proposition side. So in my speech, I'd like to first of all point out the parts that they have failed to refute, and next of all, I'd like to refute both of their arguments and explain why they cannot achieve a rational discourse on their side of the house, and last of all, I'd like to reinforce our arguments a little. So in our first argument, they have failed to attack the point that these memorials are often put in famous places, so it becomes an identity of the people inside of that country. They did not point the false point of this point, and they're actually consenting that they do place an identity upon the people. And they also concede to the point that the government is going to be creating a false narrative or a biased narrative upon these memorials and has the power to create a false narrative and a false identity to these people and saying that this was a legit thing that happened inside of war, and this thing was a bad thing that has happened in war. This the government does have an ability to do, and it's actually happening right now. Another point that was not refuted by Team Opposition. And third of all, in our second speech, we have explained why it is legit, because it forces people to have like this because it forces people to have a biased kind of discourse and does not provide the right kind of information. They also did not oppose this one. No, thank you. They only gave us examples that are only non-biased information, non-biased memorials, but they did not deny the fact, no thank you, that these biased memorials exist and proper discourse cannot be achieved in all those areas. So let's go on to opposition's case about, first of all, how the government has a principle to remember, and second of all, how remembering the war is creates a more just kind of education, and it creates a more better kind of education to prevent these future wars. First of all, the government's principle to remember about how the state was the one creating the war, so they have a responsibility to remember it. Yes, we do agree to this point that the state was the one who started this war. Citizens did not consent, and they were forced to go to this war. That's the reason why we're not actually opposing state-funded graves. Those are the things that the government has to do in order to repent and give them some place for a peace to rest. No, thank you. But not giving them a kind of memorial that is biased and gives an incorrect information about those people. No, thank you. Because it also gives us information about incorrect information, and it does not represent what the people have been done in the past correctly. That's the reason why we're going to be saying that we're going to be banning but we believe that the state should not erect a biased kind of things, and also a lot of these other memorials. And also about this, I like to deal with the point about how these non-skewed kind of information can also be a kind of a biased information to those people. Say they sustaining example about the Vietnamese War and how a lot of people have died in it and there are names written on those plaques and so on. But we believe that if the state is going to be placing those plaques in one place and not placing those plaques in another place, then that is itself a sign that is saying that the state does represent these kind of people but does not represent the other kind of people. No, thank you. And that's why we're going to be saying that even in those so-called, well, they might be representing only the names, but still that is a sign of the state representing another kind of thing. No, thank you. And it is a biased kind of information. That's why we're going to be saying that the state should not represent all of those kinds and only place those plaques. That is, no, thank you. Truly factual, like the year of where the war has started or not. And about the second point about how about their point, explaining how remembering the war is actually more effective by placing these memorials and all those other stuff in those public places. They gave us five reasons why. Emotional, because it humanizes war, because it's tangible, because it creates a storyline and seeing a lot of these, because it's different from reading, no thank you, about these facts from these books. But notice that they never explain the reason, the analysis behind all these reasons. They just named some kind of assertions that it's more emotional, but they never provided you the information why it's going to be more emotional in the first place. And I'd like to be explaining to you why it is actually more better if we don't have these kinds of memorials. First of all, about the emotional fact. They're actually saying that it's going to be affecting them emotionally, which means that it tends to be more biased than the kind of information that should be properly provided by in history classes or through the classes that we are saying that should be provided by historical professionals. Yes?
What makes the government inherently more biased than a family who sent their child to fight in this war?
Because they are emotionally motivated, they are going to be more biased than the facts that should be shown equally and unbiased to the entire people. What should be shown was not the people who sent their sons out into the war, but actually the victims who were killed by that Sun Tzu. Those kinds of opinions should also be introduced by the government, and we believe that these memorials do not do that, and that is the reason why we're going to be saying that it's not good. So thank you. And next of all, they're actually providing us how this history classes is actually going to be more important and more better at representing these wars than these historical memorials. No, thank you. It is because these are going to be represented in a neutral kind of state and not in a biased kind of state, which is going to be going on into the reinforcement of our second argument about why it is actually illegit. Well, we have three kinds of parts. First of all, because it is funded by the state, and second of all, because it doesn't end the grudge between these two actors, and third of all, because it doesn't create a proper kind of discourse. So let's go on to it is actually state funded. Since it is actually state funded, it has to represent and reflect all of the opinions inside of those people, but actually if it is going to be imposed by a certain governmental kind of state and a narrative that the government wants to be imposed upon these people, then it is not properly representative of the people. And that's why we're going to be saying that if the state is going to be funded, it can only show a certain kind of narrative to that war, and that's why the state should not create it using the citizens' taxes and not representing all of the opinions of the citizens. And second of all, it does not end the grudge between the former enemies forever. It is because since this government is providing a single kind of narrative, it is actually going to be offensive to maybe for the Japanese people if they're going to be seeing a plaque or a memorial that's glorifying the World War II upon the attack from the US to the Japan. These people from the Japan are going to be offended because the grudges will never end, because the memorial is still there, and it is going to be a biased kind of memorial. And we don't think that the government should be promoting these kinds of grudges forever, because the government's role is to provide peace and unity to the entire nations, and that is a universal role of the people. War is something morally important, and what the government should do is to end that war and end the grudges so no future conflict will happen. And memorial things are in the way because they actually represent the justice of these people doing some kinds of acts in that war. Maybe if your son is going to be sent and killed a lot of people, it's going to be justifying that act by using the state funding those memorials. And third of all, it does not provide a decent kind of a proper kind of discourse. Well, this is because that the state is only providing one kind of narrative. And we believe that what a proper discourse should be is a discourse that is going to be balancing out these two facts coming from opposite sides, and that can only be done without those statues, but only in those decent classes where they can be provided an actual facts and figures. Yes, they are actually going to be Yes, they are actually going to be facts and figures, but it does not mean that it's going to be less tangible and less emotional to these people. People can still create these kinds of movies, and people can still create these kinds of books inside of those books, and those can also be introduced inside of those classes. That's why we're going to be saying that only this decent kind of discourse and only decent discourse about the war can be occurred without those biased kind of statues that is going to be creating a false identity. From those reasons, we're going to be saying that, first of all, it's illegit for the state to present a false kind of narrative, a biased kind of narrative, and second of all, it's going to be illegit for it's going to be wrong for the state to provide a false fact to the citizens. That's why we're going to be saying that we're more than proud to stand on due proposition. Thank you.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes and 18 seconds. 8 minutes and 18 seconds.
To continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Colette Faulkner.
There are two things we told the opposition that they needed to do in order to win this debate. First, we tell them that they have to prove the harms on their side are so great that it warrants literally forgetting the millions of sacrifices that have been made all throughout history. But second, they also need to prove to you why the government apparently no longer has the principal obligation to respect the very people they forced to give up their lives for them, at the point where really their only harm is people simply aren't rational enough. We don't think they have grounds enough to say why, one, we practically shouldn't do this, and two, why there's a principal justification to forget these lives that have been lost. So, a few things in this speech today. First, a little briefing on what exactly their advocacy is doing, but then second, asking 2 points of rebuttal on which side is going to have the best actor, the second question about which side has the better outcomes. Our third point of argument, what I'll be bringing up today, is on how nationalism will increase on their side. So going really quickly on their advocacy. We're a little confused about what happens in their world. In their very last speech, they tell you that they would support things like state-funded graves. We don't understand how they, for some reason, don't think a grave that commemorates soldiers lost doesn't amount to a memorial or doesn't amount to commemorating them. We think that clearly falls on the side of the opposition today. But second, we think a very important question that has failed to be answered by the proposition is, would they accept balanced, unskewed, unbiased forms of state-ran memorials? They don't really have a clear answer here. We think at the point where their advocacy is predicated on the fact they just want unbiased memorials in general, we still think they concede with our side at the point where I'm going to show you how oftentimes these memorials, yes, are unbiased. So going to the first point of rebuttal today, is the government the right actor? Really, all three of their arguments are basically saying the same thing. The government shouldn't be biased, so let's engage with that. First of all, we don't think they've actually proved that there's any supposedly super skewed examples of memorials. We think the vast majority of cases, they're usually not skewed. They're usually not unbiased or trying to prop up some nationalist front rhetoric. Instead, when we look to the Vietnam Memorial or the Holocaust Memorial, it's literally just talking about the lives being lost. We don't understand how that's so harmful to do so. But second of all, let's take them at their highest ground. Let's suppose these memorials are terribly biased at all. We would say, one, people are inherently rational. It's strange that they would assume that people can just look at a statue and be like, oh yes, somebody that led the Confederate Army is clearly correct and we should never have any discourse about that. No, we think that's actually untrue. We think maybe in the limited minority of cases where you have biased memorials, people are rational enough to understand that they can go research and understand that they don't always have to comply with what the memorial is saying or what the government is saying. But second of all, we think that even if it is problematic, that's the thing that like spurs discourse, which is why in the United States, when it comes to memorials that like prop up Confederate leaders, we see they're literally being taken down in the status quo because of the discourse they've been told on why those things are problematic in the first place. But lastly here, on this part, they don't actually show you how their role with third parties are going to be so much more unbiased. We think why we tell you the government's a better actor, like Sarah tells you, it has certain things like accountability checks and things to ensure that what they're like putting out isn't something that's like deeply offensive. We think when you have third party coming in, there's no type of check on them, and we usually think individuals have more of a political agenda to put forth. So we think when we're talking about biases and all the harms they talk about, it's going to be a lot worse under the world, which is why we think it's more important to look at our principle where we tell you that yes, the government has its direct obligation to commemorate the very people that they forced to give their lives up. They literally concede to the fact that the state is the one that causes war. The state is the one that forces people to put their lives on the line. And really their only problem they've said they've had with like state-ran like memorials, besides that they're supposedly biased, is that like the Vietnam Memorial is only in one place and not other places. So apparently that means biases. So I guess really what their problem with memorials is that they're simply not enough. I guess let's just build more so that we cover all of our tracks. We don't really understand how there's a principal justification coming out of their side. We tell you they don't prove a harm. They don't prove why their actor is going to be better. So going to the second point of rebuttal on better outcomes. We tell you in our world, when you forget to remember these lives, you repeat the atrocities that happen. They try to ask us, well, we just don't see how this is true, why going to memorial is going to do anything. We think when you go to the Holocaust memorial, literally see a pile high of all the shoes of the victims that have been lost. It's a pretty stark look at the horrors that actually happened. We think that's fundamentally different from simply reading it in a textbook here. We think having the individual point of view of people that have actually suffered through the war is the thing that makes people care. It's the things that make people change and not want to go to war again. Really, what they just tell you here is we would rather have like classrooms and history textbooks teach this instead. We say, okay, we would like that too. But I think at the point where they're so concerned about government biases, it doesn't make sense to advocate for a government-sanctioned institution to teach about war when they're so concerned about government intervening and having too much bias. We don't see any practical reason why that makes sense in the first place. But then second, going to this point where they talk about how we need to decrease like the grudges between nations, you would say, yes, we agree. But we think when you don't have memorials that where states literally admit that they've been wrong, such as the Vietnam Memorial, where like the Americans, like we would agree that going to like Vietnam and intervening there wasn't justified or needed in the first place. When you don't have those types of moral standings, when you don't remind people of mistakes made by the governments continue to make mistakes against other nations. We think you further their grudge on their side when you don't allow that to happen. But before I continue, I'll take your point.
Are you going to create a statute for every police officer that has died during their police days?
We're not advocating for people to create like more police statues or whatever. We're simply saying governments have the obligation to commemorate the people in wars that they caused, that they forced them to give up their lives. Now this brings us to our third argument today about why we think on their side they're going to increase nationalism and therefore increase war in the long run. So first of all, why do we think people care about veterans in the first place? We would say people see veterans as ultimately giving up the biggest sacrifice to fight for our very own rights. We think also that people see veterans as being the most benign extension of government, being directly linked, meaning people think that governments have the obligation to protect their own people, which is why we would say people see veterans as deserving the utmost respect. We think, secondly, what exactly is going to happen when our states choose to not memorialize these people themselves? We would say that people then see the state as violating their obligation to veterans, as saying they no longer deserve the respect that everybody else thinks they actually deserve. In turn, we think people then see the government as becoming more corrupt for devaluing the people that protect the governmental institution, and we think that this is what's going to upset people, that this is what allows people with some rather strange views to like rise to power and propagate off of these unwarranted fears and off of these grievances that people have with the government. But why exactly is this problematic? Well, we tell you that these types of groups that play off the fears of people, that play off of people's grievances with governments, are going to be a lot more likely to like glorify the worst aspects of war and want to go to war. Why? It's because at the point where they feed off of people's fears, their solution to these fears is to simply go to war and take away any like foe or enemy. We think that's exactly what happens to their war, what happens to them. So instead, you see people being less likely to actually show soldiers and the civilian lives they've lost, but instead are showing why it's like justified to go to war. We think what happens in their side, they create a condition that makes people more acceptable to war, that lets people rise up to elect militarized leaders that are always going to want to use war as an answer to their problems. What do we see coming out of the side of the proposition? We see that what they tell you is a very strange advocacy that's really just predicated on the fact that they want unbiased morals. We think on our side we give you that, but what's the most egregious on theirs is that they make it more likely that we have to build more memorials to remember more people that have to give up their lives. Thank you.
The previous speakers had 8 minutes and 18 seconds.
And now I call the proposition third speaker, Mai Kambara.
When people see the statue of Mario Nelson in Trafalgar Square, it seems pretty neutral in first glance because it's only a statue of Nelson pointing up towards the sky. But what people don't understand, that when a state makes a statue, it inherently links to the result of the war. When people see the statue of Mario Nelson, they inherently link it to the victory that they had. They take it as a sign of victory that England was able to take over Napoleon. We say that in these instances, it's very hard for these states to be able to create these neutral statues. We say that we have to make sure we have other methods to make sure that they can have a proper discourse without being influenced by whatever the state created. So I'll be talking about 3 things within my speech. Firstly, the effects on the people around them and their discourse. Secondly, which better commemorates the people who died for it. And then thirdly, which better brings peace. But before that, one question to the opposition. So they've been stating about how most of the statues are neutral in the status quo, how they only serve to be solemn and commemorate. But we'd like to ask them on that side about how this is ensured in the views of the citizens. Even if they only state facts, we say that citizens can view them in a different manner. No, thank you. And so moving on, my first point, the effect on the people and their discourse. So we have to look at 2 different types of statues here. Ones that are meant to be solemn and ones that are definitely glorified. So firstly, the ones that are solemn. We have to understand though first that this motion we should take into consideration more about ones that are glorified. But if we take in their case and think about ones that are solemn, we have to understand, that they still emphasize on whether they lost or whether they won. Even if it's neutral, even if it serves to write everyone's name on those plaques. We say that once the state creates something, it inevitably shows a message about the state. Why the state built the statue in the first place? Because they wanted to show that they won, because they wanted to show that they lost, because they wanted to show that they had these casualties. We say that either way, even if it's meant to be neutral, the citizens will not take it that way at all times. We say that when the state creates something, that's inevitable.
Seeing as the state would also create the education you provide, if that's excluded too, how do you plan on giving people any information?
Education is different in the sense that everyone understands that it's firstly given facts and they give the different perspectives in education, right? We have internet, right? They give different perspectives, but moreover, education, I think it isn't just made by the government. The textbooks are published by individual companies. We say that these are a better alternative than the state rather forcing these ideas from their statutes indirectly. But so moving back, We say that on their side, they've mentioned about the accountability of these statues, how the people will be able to go against the state if they create something that's bad, and that's why things become neutral. We have to understand, and thank you, that even these citizens are motivated by the gains or the losses of their country. If the country shows a statue about a war that they lost, they're going to be more incentivized to take into consideration more the losses that they had in that war. But if the state creates a statue that's about a war that they won, they're going to be more incentivized to see it as a victory and to mention how they won, what they did to win. We say that in that case, things can't be truly solemn or truly neutral. But secondly, when they're glorified, which is pretty much ignored as an existence itself in the opposition, we have to understand that when we commemorate something, it's kept in memory by a celebration or a memorial. Thank you. So these countries do have an incentive to show that they are glorified. Why? Because it's a war that they started. They want to show it in the best way possible, the best outcome for them. So if they did lose, they want to make it seem like the enemy was such a bad person. No, thank you. Or if they did win, they wanted to show how good they were, how much they won compared to the others. We say that in this case, we have to understand that this view is going to be skewed in the eye of the citizens, which is very detrimental for them to actually rationally think about the wars that happened. But secondly, which better commemorates these people? Yes, thank you. Yes, the government did start the war. We can't deny that. They're the ones who say, hey, we're going to war. But what we have to understand here, that especially because the government started the war, it's bad for the government to create a plaque that either glorifies or not glorifies these people's death. Because you can't just put these thousands of people's death on the line there, put it on a plaque and say, hey, we commemorated them, and that's done. It doesn't matter whether they have the background of these people on there or not, because when it's a statue, it places more significance on the symbolical meaning rather than what's actually encrypted on there. If it's the symbolical meaning that they want, then surely these deaths are going to be overlooked. We say that it's more significant to let the people know exactly how many people died, exactly why they died, exactly why this war even happened in the first place. Yes.
States force hundreds of thousands of people to fight in war. Why does the government have the same obligation to erase them from history?
We're not erasing them from history in no case, even on our side of the path, because we do provide the statistics and we do provide the education. We're saying that just writing them on the plaque and saying that's commemoration on their side cannot be justified. We say that it's wrong for the government to use these glorifications to say we had these sacrifices, but in the end we won, or in the end we lost. No, thank you. And now we have to lastly, we have to talk about which better promotes peace. Because I think it's neutral on both sides of the houses today that the most important thing about this war is to think about it afterwards and that it leads to peace, to make sure that these atrocities do not happen again. So which provides more or a better quality of peace, should I say? You have to look at the perspectives of people from other countries, from the outside regions, and the perspectives of the people on the inside. So firstly, the perspectives of people on the outside. Now let me be quite frank here and tell you that when the Americans glorify the Enola Gay, us Japanese do not feel particularly comfortable about that. Because they're saying that that bomb was able to lead them to victory over this that they had. In the end they won. We say that this kind of interpretations of war is very dangerous when you have to consider that wars were started between grudges of two countries. To have a more neutral and more better world peace, we have to make sure that all they have are statistics and proofs rather than an interpreted option by the government that would want to make them seem as a better actor. But secondly, about the people on the inside, we say that it's important to have an education rather than taking everything from these statues. Even because we say that these statues made by the state is especially bad because they are in the public eye, because they have a brand that they were made by the state, so people are more likely to believe that. We say that although the opposition quite disagrees, individual statues are not as damaging and they do not have the same extent of harm as public-made statues do. Because when they're individual, people understand that it's only an expression of that individual thought rather than the nation as a whole. We say that in these instances, We need to make sure that we have a less skewed view of these wars to make sure that we can think about them neutrally and have a rational way to show that there is going to be peace in the later years. And that is why we are still very proud to propose this motion.
Yeah.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes and 60 seconds.
And now I call the opposition third speaker, Ellie Grossman.
Let us be very explicit about the burdens of both sides in this round. First of all, side opposition does not have to prove that every single statue or memorial glorifying war is good, just that they should be allowed to stand. We can support things like historians weighing in on historical accuracy. We don't have to support things like flagrant nationalism, though we do tell you how those statues are justifiable anyways. But side proposition does have to prove that statues and memorials are so inherently wrong that it justifies the fact that they should never be allowed to stand. That means they have to do two things, which we've brought you down the bench, which they haven't done. First, they have to prove that it's acceptable to forget the people who were, by their own admission, dragged into war without consent. But second, they have to prove that the inherent harms of such statues are so massive it justifies not doing anything at all. But because those who forget the past are the most doomed to repeat it, we are proud to oppose. Now let's get into the core questions of today's round. The first one here is, which side is principally correct? What do we bring to you on our side of the house? We bring to you an obligation to remember the human side of war. Now, Proposition 2 literally agrees with this argument. In fact, we would say Proposition 2, in fact, crosses the house when they say we believe that the state should fund graves for those who died in war. We think graves ostensibly are a memorial. They're literally meant to remember the people who died in war. That's a point for us. But then they ask Colette this point of information of if we would memorialize police officers. We think this is distinct for two main reasons. First of all, because you volunteer to be a police officer, you do not volunteer to be drafted in or murdered in a war. But second, though we respect the duty that police officers have and how important it is, we do not think that everyday service has the same gravity as an all-out war does. But furthermore, we tell you this is especially important because it holds the state accountable to its people. It forces the state to admit its mistakes. If anything, that is promoting the fact that it knows it did something wrong and not nationalism. The Vietnam Memorial in the United States shows that the United States dragged itself into a war it never should have been in, not the other way around. We force states to remember their victims instead of sweeping them under the rug, as side proposition would tell you to do. But here's the principle they bring to you. All they tell you is that it's illegitimate for the state to skew a narrative. This principle is completely hung on the idea that the state is inherently skewed in the first place. They have to prove that it is skewed in all scenarios. We do not always defend the state line, but we tell you that if the narrative is skewed, it's good in the long run. I'll touch that later. But furthermore, they undermine their own principle in a couple of core places. The first is when they say, well, the state should literally fund memorials, that being graves. And second, when they say individuals can erect nationalistic memorials all they want to. Colette illustrates why those are worse, and I'll get to that again later. They undermine their own principle when they do that. So why do we win this argument? Because we prove you preserve the memory of the victims of war, and you hold the state accountable without promoting this inherent skew. But the second core question of today's round is, which side promotes a better narrative for the victims of war? Now, the core question here is, are all government narratives skewed? That's what they bring to you. We say, first of all, a lot of government narratives are neutral and factual. They might just list names or just show an image. We think that commemorates the victims of war, and that's a good thing. But second, we tell you, even if you do hypothetically believe that there are a lot of glorifications of war, and we take them at their highest ground, that is still acceptable, even a good thing, for a couple of reasons. First of all, we tell you it promotes a common discourse around the idea of war. We would tell you that in Colette's example of the United States, there's a lot more discourse around the statues of Confederates than there ever will be around a simple textbook. But second, as we tell you in Opposition 1, often these glorify people throwing off the chains of oppression. So if Haiti sets up a statue of Toussaint Louverture, who freed Haitians from slavery in a violent revolution, we think that's a good thing. Is it glorifying war? Yes. Perhaps, but is it glorifying freedom from oppression as well? We think that's true. We believe, and the next argument they bring to you is, okay, sure, but people are just so irrational, so even if statues aren't neutral, people will see them the wrong way anyways. We think neither side of the house solves for that. Since they want the state to run this curriculum, irrational people will be irrational anyways. Colette tells you why they get worse. I'll get to that again in a minute. But furthermore, something really important that they bring to you in Proposition 1 is that they believe things like oppression are objective and we should memorialize those. We think there are wars where that is absolutely the case. So when you remember the Jewish partisans who fought against the Nazis in World War II, we think that is objective. We do not think they deserve to be only a footnote in history in a textbook. When you remember the people who fought to free slaves, the slaves who rose up against oppressors, we think that is good. They cross to our side of the house when they agree with that statement. But what do they bring to you as an alternative? They bring to you simply that we should have textbooks, we should have curriculum. First, let's state the obvious. Side opposition can also have textbooks that teach the history of war. Both sides can do this. But second, as Colette brings to you, a lot of textbooks simply aren't neutral. If the state is going to lie in a statute, they're probably going to lie in a state-run curriculum. States often do this, but furthermore, we would say that often even in states that don't run their curriculum, there's still a biased narrative. We would say, in the United States, like you say, there's no memorial to dropping a bomb on Japan. We agree it's horrible. People only glorify it after they read that it won the war in textbooks. What is there a memorial to in the United States? There's a Thousand Cranes Memorial, which memorializes a girl who died from the radiation poisoning after a bomb was dropped in Japan. That was created in America. That memorializes the fact that the United States should have never committed such a human rights atrocity. That is why we support memorials in this scenario. So why do we win this argument? Because we prove to you that in most cases, skew doesn't exist. But if it does, either it promotes discourse, and people often bring those statues down, or second, it promotes memorialization of victims of oppression and the chains they threw off. Third core question in today's round. Which side prevents violence in the future? But before I move on, go ahead.
Yes, promoting discourse is good in normal private ones, but why is this a legit reason to provide, for the government to provide biased memorials to the society?
Well, first of all, as I just addressed, not all memorials are inherently biased. Second, because they created the war, they have the duty to account for it. Third, because often victims of oppression were killed under their rule, they should be teaching about that instead of forcing the oppressed to always memorialize themselves. The state has a duty to do that. Okay, so we tell you that one of the core ways we prevent these future harms is because you can't forget the past when there are memorials. We give you 5 reasons that this is true. First of all, these memorials are a lot more emotional. Second, they're a lot more human. Third, they're a lot more tangible. You can interact with them. Fourth, they're a lot more individualized instead of a sweeping statistic. And fifth, they're a lot more salient. They give you one answer. Why are these more emotional? Colette tells you that when you can look at things and engage with them and see the faces that were harmed in war, that creates more emotional reaction. And that makes people think about the human consequences of war and think twice before they get into a war again. But furthermore, we tell you that's especially important because it increases empathy. It makes people care about the victims of war. That's why people are more likely to give to charities that support veterans, to give to charities that support these victims. But finally, why do we tell you it gets worse in their world? Colette illustrates this at the end of the Opposition 2. They never engage with it. We tell you that when states refuse to honor veterans, people get mad. They think that the state is not honoring this sacrifice. What does this do? Not only do they set up more nationalistic memorials in response, but they're more likely to vote for war-hungry populists, people who they see as preserving this change. That's who brings you into war in the future. We honor victims without fueling conflict. We believe that is principally right, and that is why we are proud to oppose.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes and 5 seconds.
We now move to the team's 4 minutes concluding reply speeches. To deliver the opposition reply speech, I call upon Colette Faulkner.
Their advocacy was three things today. First, they would support state-funded graves that are unequivocally memorials. Two, they would support education, which is state-sponsored. And thirdly, we're not really sure if they would support balance done by state-sanctioned memorials. We think those three things have been their advocacy, and when called out about it, you still have failed to hear an answer from student opposition. So a few things in the speech today. First, briefly going over the framing, and then telling you what we've won on the principle and the practical level today. So, what we made really clear, once again, first, when it comes to the burdens we set up, they haven't proven that there's enough harms to warrant, erasing soldiers from history and their sacrifices, but two, they haven't given principled justification of why the state doesn't have an obligation to remember those people. We think at the point where they failed to meet those key burdens, they failed to win the debate today. So, first going to the principal reason of why we won today. They try to tell you that their principle is basically state shouldn't be biased, which is hung basically on their practical arguments. We tell you that first, at the point where they don't have any examples of how these memorials are biased, we're a little confused of what this looks like. But second, at the point where they literally undermine their own advocacy by advocating for state-sponsored things, which I guess are inherently biased too, we don't think they really have a principle, which is why we tell you that our principle of saying that the government, yes, does have the obligation to remember those people that they literally forced to die for them, whether it be via drafts, or whether it be marginalized groups such as the Tuskegee Airmen in America, or women all across the world that have been denied rights by the very governments that tell them that they have to put their lives on the lives on them. We think when it comes to that principle, that yes, it still stands that governments have that obligation to respect these people, to value them, to remember them. No answer coming out of theirs. But moreover, we think this matters because at the point where the state fails to meet that obligation, when they forget, we think that means the state becomes complacent in addressing those issues and becomes complacent in preventing those issues and those lives from being lost again in the future. And this brings us to the practical reason of why we won today. We tell them we're going to take them at their highest ground. So maybe these memorials are somewhat problematic and glorified. We gave them two answers to this. We told them that we think that it actually sparks discourse if it's problematic. We think, second of all, that doing things such as celebrating a war where a country overthrew the repressors is an inherently negative thing, but something that should be glorified, that should be celebrated. Once again, no answer from their side. But second of all, we tell you why we went on the practical level, but is we actually decrease the likelihood of war. We tell you at the point where memorials show the stark and immense horrors of what actually goes on in a war, that makes people want to care and not repeat it. That's literally why the Holocaust Memorial tells you that their main thing is to not forget what happened so we don't repeat it in the future. We think on their side, when they take away the biggest memorials that are ran by governments in the status quo, they take away the chance from people being able to care, from people being able to have that education, from people being able to prevent these things happening from the future. But second, what we would tell you here, on their side, they're actually going to be the ones that let the government choose to forget, that let the government fuel the nationalists who actually want to go to war more. That's exactly what we told you in our third argument. At the point where governments choose to say that veterans aren't valuable, that they don't deserve the respect, that makes nationalists want to rise up, want to be able to gain political control so that they can make the likelihood of war happen more. We haven't seen any engagement when it comes to our third argument here. So, what do we tell you when the round comes to a close? We think it's very clear that one, yes, our obligation, that states do have this principal obligation to ensure that the people that they send to war are actually remembered and not forgotten, still exists. But second of all, we tell you when it comes to the practical outcomes, on our side, we make a future that's less likely to even have the need to have a memorial in the first place. On our side, we ensure that war isn't going to keep happening.
decision and the debate as a whole, I call upon Ayumi Sadro.
Three questions in this debate. 1. Which side better respects the dignity of the dead? 2. Does the state's commemoration or glorification of these war heroes create bias within the people? 3. Which is better, a state-sanctioned discourse or free discourse? I'm going to answer these questions one by one. So 1. Which side better respects the dignity of the dead? And this was their main case from coming from opposition. They said that we have to remember those people who fought for what was right. As the previous speaker already told you, we actually better respect the dignity of these people and continue to remember what they contributed to the war, just not in a skewed way. What the opposition does is literally uses these victims of war to forward their own ideologies about what is right and what is wrong. You're using them and these lives that they put on the line for a political narrative. That's something that's morally abhorrent. And we think that on proposition, we better respect the dignity of the dead because we show the factual information that is objective about their lives and continue to teach through neutral education about what happened during the war. We think that we better respect the dignity of those who are dead. But secondly, does the state's commemoration or glorification of these war military fights create bias within the people? The opposition told you that it does not create bias because these memorials are not skewed in the first place. We say to that their objective of the state may not always be skewed, but they can cause skewed opinions to take place because of the structural problems that I told you from first speaker. When I said that when the state says something when the state creates a statue, that is perceived by people as a legitimate narrative and the only narrative that can be seen in that situation. We think that there is a structural problem that makes these statues be perceived in a skewed manner that creates skewed narratives within the people. So we think that the state's commemoration does create bias within the people. And then thirdly, which is better, a state-sanctioned discourse or free discourse? So later on in their speech, they told us that free discourse is worse because you create more division. 3 responses. 1, they characterize people as rational, as being able to combat these skewed narratives of these government, if it exists. But they still tell us that people will be influenced by these nationalists into having this divided discourse. We think that they're being contradictory in that way. But secondly, we think that you don't have to have these memorials to have these discourse. And thirdly, when we create a balanced education, when we have neutral views that just doesn't impose one certain narrative over another, we think that that betters the discourse because you allow people to have the same ground to debate about. But when you have this state-sanctioned discourse and state-sanctioned views about war, and you have these skewed narratives, you're going to create you're going to make people stop moving forward and stop actively trying to stop war in the future because they have too much pride in what their country did in the past. So because on our side, we think that we're going to create more progress and more people recognizing the atrocities of war as well as the neutral views of all the people that were involved. We think that the state should not create these statues that commemorate or glorify war. That's why we're very proud to propose.
Yes.
The previous speaker is silent 4 minutes and the floor is 5 minutes.
Thank you to all speakers for this debate. We ask everyone to leave the room while the judges complete their scorecards and make their decisions. They will then announce the result of this debate.
why the panel came to this decision. So today we had a unanimous decision in favor of the opposition United States. So before we move on to the actual content of the debate, we would like to clarify certain things. First, regarding strategy, remember that if you have good points, they shouldn't come out late in the debate. We actually saw very, very good things, very good points, well explained at the very end of the debate, and I think that the whole panel agrees that it would have enriched the debate much more if they would have come up earlier in the debate and would have made both cases stronger. Second, when you bring POIs, especially if you think that they're POIs that prove your case, that are important, significant, and relevant, when you or another member of your team comes back to deliver their speech, bring it up again and explain the logic behind it and say why is that actually proving your point. Because maybe the other team, even with a bad answer, can get away with it if you don't make a point out of that. And lastly, it is important to remember the motion we're actually debating and to bear in mind all the different parts of the motion, because at certain points we were, for instance, forgetting that the motion at some point said glorify. We never actually understood what glorifying was and what do we mean by this monuments or statues that glorify soldiers or campaigns, military campaigns. So apart from that, we saw that both teams agreed on two things. One, the need to prevent future wars, and second, the need to remember these people. So although they agreed on that, obviously they had to prove the different ways in which this can be done. Team proposition said that it would be better to do it with the memorials and with the statues, as this has an advantage over other ways that shows us that they have empathy, they can be tangible, they can be emotional, and that this is superior in some way to the other alternatives that we have. And on the other side, Team Japan told us that the main problem with this is the narrative behind this and the bias we can have because of this monument. We believe that on this principal issue, though it was better, Team Japan's case was better refuted by the United States, was not, there was not a clear difference on this point, but the main difference between both teams came to the practical reasons. What were the practical reasons? Okay, if we approve this motion, if we don't have any more memorials, what are we going to do? In what way are we going to prevent war, and in what way are we going to remember this moment? So the alternatives we have were education, personal memorials, or graves, for instance. But I believe that through even if strategy, Team United States was able to show that even in these different alternatives, the case, the motion did not stand. On the one hand, education, somebody writes the textbooks as it was said throughout the debates, and if there's a bias in memorials, why shouldn't there be a bias in the textbooks or in the national curricula? We don't believe this point was bulletproof. It could have been refuted, but we were waiting for a better answer on this point. Second, the potential bias on personal commemorations was also an important point and was not refuted. Remember that it's very important to evolve throughout the case, and if one of my points is being refuted, we need to say something else. We cannot just repeat our own case, but to show more reasons why our point is still standing, even though it has been refuted. And thirdly, this issue about graves and whether or not they were the same to memorials, the panel believed that the underlying meaning of these graves, the underlying logic was quite similar, and it was well argued on team opposition that they were more or less the same. Going down to the the second point on prevention, we believe that it had two parts. On the one hand, preventing it in the same community, the same nation, and we believe that this issue is kind of a deadlock, because on the one hand, it's good to have memorials that produce emotion on the people, but on the other hand, textbooks are also good when it comes to showing how things actually were and giving a more complete view. But then when it came to this international perspective of whether or not other countries would be more prone to get angry or have a reaction to these memorials, we believe that this issue went to team opposition because it was better argued and we lacked examples that clearly showed how this was going to actually prevent the external potential aggressions or tense relations. So overall, we believe that it was a very good debate, very close, clear but close debate. Both teams did a great job. We had very good styles in this debate, and we congratulate all 6 speakers and wish them very good luck for the next rounds.